Thank you. Thanks very much, John. And John, you know that I'm a huge fan of CRIC, and as a result, I'm delighted to be taking part in the annual conference on this terribly important theme. I wasn't present for all of yesterday's proceedings, but I thoroughly enjoyed the presentations and the discussions that I was able to observe both yesterday and today. And I hope that my comments today will add something useful to what's been said already. A number of speakers have offered what we might call ground level perspectives today, and I'll be offering more of a kind of international or comparative political perspective. But I should issue a cautionary note. I'm not presenting a research paper. I've been very impressed with the research underpinning a lot of the presentations yesterday and today. What I'm going to be offering really is more in the spirit of casual remarks. But as I said, I hope that they'll still be of some value. I've titled my presentation "Challenges for Multilateralism Post-COVID," a little optimistic here. However, I don't need to remind you that even before COVID-19, we were living in challenging times for the multilateral system. In the UK, where I work and reside, the agony of Brexit posed and continues to pose its own set of challenges for multilateralism, not only in the European context, but also more widely. In Brazil, to give another example, under Bolsonaro, it's evident that traditional Brazilian principles of diplomacy, including democratic multilateralism, have taken a back seat. And everywhere in the world, the assault on the multilateral system by the US government since the election of Donald Trump has been dramatic and in some respects absolutely unprecedented. I could go on. The examples that I've given are really only meant to be illustrative, and sadly they are by no means exhaustive. But I want to say first that it's important to distinguish the assault on multilateralism, or the retreat from multilateralism, from other adverse trends that we're witnessing, in particular the rise in authoritarianism, which has been occurring at the same time. For the 14th consecutive year now, the 14th year in a row, Freedom House has reported a decline in global freedoms. Meanwhile, the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index tells us that democratic rights around the world are at their lowest ebb since their survey began in 2006. Only 22 countries today, according to the unit, qualify as full democracies, while more than a third now live under authoritarianism. So I say it's important to distinguish authoritarianism from challenges to multilateralism, because authoritarianism isn't necessarily incompatible with multilateralism. If you take Russia, an authoritarian state under Vladimir Putin, Russia doesn't necessarily want to see the rules-based international order eroded. When Putin and other senior officials express a desire to maintain international law and the central role of the UN, as they have done on several occasions, they're not just paying lip service to multilateralism. For them, the Security Council, the UN Security Council, is an important forum. They're permanent members of the Council, they have veto-wielding power, and as a consequence, Russia exercises considerable influence there. It may not exercise that influence in support of democratic freedoms or human rights, but it doesn't seek a world in which there's no institutional constraints on power, other states' power, that is, however weak those constraints can be. Now, another caveat: although we're talking about the challenges for multilateralism as a matter of concern, we need to remember that multilateralism is not necessarily, in all cases, a good thing. The 1956 invasion of Egypt by the UK, France, and Israel, the Suez Crisis, that was an act of multilateralism, and it wasn't a good thing, and not because it failed. The 2003 invasion of Iraq by the US, the UK, Australia, and Poland was also an act of multilateralism, and again, not a good thing. Sometimes multilateralism is just a cover for great powers to do not so great things that they would find awkward to do entirely on their own. And that's because multilateralism confers varying degrees of legitimacy, even if that legitimacy is sometimes only paper thin. Let's also not forget that international cooperation, the underpinning of multilateralism, does not eliminate international competition. And we see evidence of that now in the efforts to fight the COVID pandemic. At the same time that scientists of all nationalities are working together to produce a vaccine, and that's one form of multilateralism, states are vying with each other to be the first in line to obtain these vaccines for their own populations, what's been described as vaccine nationalism. Sundeep talked a little bit about this yesterday. The multilateral organization that should be coordinating international efforts to produce a vaccine, the World Health Organization, was forced to redesign its global COVID-19 vaccine procurement facility because rich and powerful states were slow to sign up to the facility and sought bilateral deals instead. Now, that facility, known as COVAX, aims to ensure the equitable distribution globally of some 2 billion doses of effective vaccines by the end of 2021. And this, by the way, is the same organization that the Trump administration is withdrawing the United States from, thus depriving it of vital funding, some 22% of its core budget, at a time when the world's facing one of the most serious health crises in the organization's history. Well, finally, it's also important to bear in mind that the challenges to multilateralism have not all originated from without. Multilateralism, as it's been practiced, that is real existing multilateralism, has sometimes carried within it its own seeds of decay. In a new book, which the political scientist Vivian Schmidt has just published, she dissects the EU's crisis of legitimacy, as she titles the book, pinpointing the EU's preoccupation with rules rather than with the welfare of its member states, to explain why the Eurozone crisis from 2009 so seriously tarnished the EU's reputation and weakened support for the organization. Others have decried the EU's democratic deficit, the fact that many European citizens do not feel that they're adequately represented in European decision-making. In a survey of 10 European countries in 2019 by the Pew Research Center, an average of 62% of those surveyed said that the EU does not understand the needs of its citizens. And that's a pretty poor record. Of course, it could be argued that at least some of the disruptions that we're witnessing are only momentary, that with the passing of the Trump administration, for instance, whenever that occurs, we can expect to see at least a partial reversal of retreat from multilateralism. And that may be true. If Biden's elected, we'd certainly expect his administration to take a less unilateralist approach to international relations. Indeed, he's declared that the US would rejoin the WHO on his first day in office. But the problem is that some of the damage to multilateralism that will have been done by then will not be easy to reverse, if it'll be possible to reverse at all. So, for instance, arms control. Having dismantled some of the pillars of the international architecture that's kept the nuclear peace both regionally and globally, the US may not find it that easy to put those pillars back in place if that's what it seeks to do. For instance, if the US decides to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal, which the Obama-Biden administration negotiated and which Trump repudiated, the deal which has arguably helped to restrain the development of an Iranian nuclear arsenal, it may be too late. Iran may not wish to reaffirm its commitment to an arrangement that's predicated on the goodwill of its signatories after the US has failed to honor its commitments. And similarly, the US withdrawal from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which for 3 decades barred the US and Russia from deploying short and intermediate range nuclear missiles, and the likelihood that the US will allow the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which limits strategic nuclear forces, to die when it expires in 2021, if Trump is still president. These are all fatal blows to critical components of the nuclear arms regime, the nuclear arms control regime. It may be possible to reverse the damage, but it may not be possible. Some of it may be, as I said, irreversible. But just to round out the picture, it's certainly the case in the age of COVID-19 that at the same time that we're witnessing assaults on the multilateral system, we're also witnessing stepped up support for multilateralism. And encouraging examples provided by recent experience in Israel and Palestine, a forthcoming study by the Israeli Institute for National Security Studies reports that the pandemic underscored the mutually dependent relations between Israel and Palestine and the Palestinian Authority, and realizing that the collapse of the PA could have a dire impact on its own security, Israel expended unusual and significant efforts to help the PA face the coronavirus threat. During the first wave of the pandemic, both sides jointly implemented practical measures to keep the situation under control, both at home and next door. Measures that included coordination between the ministries of health of the PA and Israel. There were joint training sessions for medical personnel, and medical supplies were distributed to the Palestinian public by Israel, with extra funds being released by Israel to the Palestinian Authority, and in joint coordination, tens of thousands of Palestinian workers being allowed to remain in Israel to continue to work there. The report concludes the COVID-19 pandemic is a clarion call for environment-based threats requiring coordination across jurisdictions to mitigate threats to national health, prosperity, and security. So Scott was asking earlier to Alberto, what good came of COVID-19 for Colombia? Well, here's an example of some good that came to Palestine and Israel, sadly not lasting because relations have deteriorated again. But it does show that it is possible, bilateral, multilateral arrangements are possible at the same time alongside that we are witnessing, as I said, this retreat from multilateralism. So if the challenges to multilateralism are real, as I just pointed out, so too are the prospects to meeting those challenges, even among adversaries. But what can be done then to strengthen multilateralism? Well, one of the curious things is that despite what some national leaders may be saying against multilateral efforts and against multilateral institutions, public opinion in support of multilateralism and the UN system in particular is high and has been consistently so for many years, well before Trump was elected and throughout his time in office. According to the Pew Research Center, the same survey that I cited earlier, across 32 countries surveyed in 2019, an average of 61% expressed a positive view of the United Nations, while an average of just 26% expressed a negative view. So that's quite a significant level of support. In the United States specifically, nearly 60% of those surveyed expressed a favorable opinion of the United States. And in its own polling, the United Nations Foundation found that a whopping 88% of Americans want the US to maintain an active role in the UN. And similarly, when surveyed about NATO, 77%, or nearly 8 in 10 Americans, said that being a member of NATO is good for the US. So, and I could go on with other views of other organizations, but the important thing, what I want to stress, is that these votes of confidence by the public in multilateralism are not a recent phenomenon. This has been the pattern for many, many years. Now, what this tells us is that the assault on multilateralism is often not driven by or in response to popular demand. The public, on the whole, is not hostile to multilateralism. To the contrary, there's popular support for it. Part of the problem is that whether viewed favorably or not, the work of international organizations, especially their achievements, is not always well known or well enough understood. Multilateral organizations generally do a very bad job of communicating what they do to the general public, and the media don't give them very much attention either, or if they do, they get a disproportionate amount of bad press. Another problem is that while the general public may be favorably disposed towards multilateralism, it is increasingly a partisan issue. So in the United States, for instance, the share of Democrats who have a positive view of the United Nations is generally higher than the share of Republicans, and that partisan gap has been growing year on year. The partisan divide makes the public more susceptible to manipulation, and perhaps this is what explains the lack of public appreciation for the work of the WHO during the current pandemic. The US public rates the WHO's pandemic response more negatively than it does its own national health authorities. 72% of US adults surveyed said national public health officials, such as those at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, were doing a good job in dealing with the pandemic, whereas just 46% of Americans gave the WHO positive remarks. Now, does this reflect a lack of understanding of what the WHO does, or is it evidence of Trump's message getting through? I mean, he's obviously been rubbishing the WHO since the start, or is it a combination of both? So one thing that can be done is to develop ways of increasing public awareness and strengthening public understanding of the work of the UN, the EU, and other multilateral organizations. Now, I appreciate that that's a lot more easily said than done. If only the answer were to produce more academic studies on the multilateral system, we academics could look forward to a much better rate of return on our grant applications, but I know that's not the answer. On a more serious note, maybe this is where our schools could be doing a better job. Target 4.7 of the Sustainable Development Goals calls for the mainstreaming of what it calls global citizenship education in national education policies, in curricula, teacher education, and student assessment, focusing more attention on the work of international organizations in our schools is an ambition that is certainly consistent with this target. Another idea that's gaining traction is the notion of inclusive multilateralism. Now, we talked about inclusivity earlier today. Inclusive multilateralism is the term that UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres used in his address to the General Assembly last year. If part of the problem is that multilateral institutions seem remote and out of touch with the public, then more should be done to include the public in the work of the organizations. And that means, in his words, closer and more meaningful contacts with civil society, businesses, and other stakeholders. Now, how might that be achieved? Well, and we've been talking a little bit about this too, in talking about digital technologies. They clearly offer unprecedented opportunities for various constituencies to weigh in on a whole host of issues. But to be effective, these constituencies need to feel that their voice genuinely matters. And the difficulty, and we discussed this yesterday, is that states are often reluctant to yield space to non-state actors. Now, of course, formal participation in intergovernmental organizations is not the only way to influence the work of these organizations. Indeed, we've seen a flourishing of joined-up civic action across the globe against racism, against climate change, against sexual violence, and many of these efforts have had considerable effect on multilateral efforts. Alberto's presentation, by the way, reminded me of another important form of multilateralism, which is informal groups of friends. That is, groups of states who provide sustenance or support to national and regional peace processes. These have been very, very successful, often operating quietly and maybe more effectively for the fact that they are operating quietly. But that's another form of multilateralism that I think that deserves considerable support. Now, my last thought, but not the last word, on reviving multilateralism is the importance of leadership. It's a hackneyed term, I realize that, but if you contrast national leaders, how national leaders welcomed the advent of multilateralism following World War II, with how many of them treat those institutions today, the difference is really striking. Now, it'd be naive to think that the early optimism at the end of World War II could have been sustained indefinitely. But leaders set the tone for how their publics view the international institutions of which their states are members. The UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali once quipped that the letters SG in his title stood not for Secretary General, but for scapegoat. And indeed, it's been very convenient for national leaders to scapegoat the UN and other multilateral organizations for their own failings as heads of state, thus facilitating the retreat from multilateralism that we've been observing. I mean, as I said, look at Trump's rubbishing of the WHO. But there are also lots of examples of positive leadership in this regard. The question is how to promote these good practices. It's a hard problem, and there are no easy answers. I recognize that. So just to conclude, multilateralism is not a panacea, and multilateral organizations are not without their weaknesses, some of them very serious indeed. Multilateral organizations, for instance, have not been up to the task of managing the Syrian crisis effectively, as again we discussed in the earlier session on mediation. But it's an illusion to think that many of the advances that humanity has made, the eradication of smallpox and polio, the dramatic reduction of the ozone hole, the lifting of millions of people out of poverty, and the elimination of entire classes of lethal weapons, that these advances and many others could have been achieved by states acting on their own. It's also an illusion to think that many of the critical challenges that lie ahead, arms proliferation, mass migration, regulation of outer space, cybersecurity, biodiversity, and global warming, as well as the spread of infectious diseases, that these challenges can be met without states and peoples cooperating more closely. So thanks very much for your attention.